slammed shut. An old woman stood on the front steps of a farmhouse she had lived in for 40 years, holding a cardboard box against her chest. Her hands shook, but not from the cold. Her hair was white and pulled back tight. Her face was the face of a woman who had already cried all the tears she had left and was surprised to find a few more waiting. Behind her, a man in a charcoal suit walked back to a black sedan parked on the gravel drive. His shoes were polished. His briefcase swung at his side. He did not look back, not once. She called his name, quietly at first, then louder. The syllables cracked in her throat like dry wood. He kept walking. The car door opened. The car door closed. The engine started low and expensive. The tires rolled over the gravel with a sound like bones breaking. And just like that, the woman and her husband were alone, completely alone. Her name was Adeline Whitaker. She was 68 years old. Her husband Everett stood in the doorway behind her, one hand on the frame to hold himself up. He was 70. His knees were bad. His hands were bent at the knuckles from 50 years of gripping hammers and chisels and saws. They had raised 4 children in that house. 4. And now there was nobody left. But here's the thing. This couple did not collapse. They did not beg. They didn't sit down in that empty house and wait to die. They walked into a forest older than the state of North Carolina, found a tree older than anything in that valley, and built a home inside it. A hidden home. One nobody was ever supposed to find. But somebody did. And what that somebody found inside the trunk of that tree destroyed a family, exposed a crime that had been buried for 30 years, and turned an old woman nobody in Charlotte had bothered to call on her birthday into the most feared name on a lawyer's desk. Stay with me on this one, because the thing you think you know about this story you do not know yet. Briar Hollow sits in the last knuckle of the Blue Ridge Mountains before you cross into Tennessee. It is the kind of town where the post office is also the hardware store, where the diner has 4 booths, and one of them is always reserved for whoever the mayor happens to be that year, and where a man named Whitaker has owned the same 160 acres of hillside since before the Civil War. Everett Whitaker was a carpenter. Not the kind who built kitchens for people who summered in Asheville, the kind who climbed up on Ruth Miller's roof in January to patch a leak because Ruth Miller was a widow and her son lived in Seattle and would not come home. The kind who charged what he thought was fair and then knocked $20 off anyway because, as he always said, he didn't need the $20 more than Ruth did. His hands were scarred. His knuckles were swollen from 40 winters of working outside in weather that would have kept younger men indoors. There was a crescent scar on the back of his right thumb from a chisel that slipped when he was 19. He had a way of looking at a piece of wood the way other men looked at a woman they had loved a long time. He saw what was inside it. Adeline kept the house. She grew tomatoes and pole beans and 3 kinds of squash in a garden out back that her own grandmother had first turned over in 1922. She canned pickles in the fall. She sewed clothes for her children when store-bought was too expensive, which was most of the time. She baked cornbread in a cast-iron skillet her mother had handed her on her wedding day, and she cooked supper every night in a heavy cast-iron pot black as coal, dented on one side from the time Preston had knocked it off the stove when he was 6. That pot had come down from Everett's grandmother. It had fed 3 generations of Whitakers before Adeline ever stirred a spoon in it. She could take a pound of stew meat and a handful of potatoes and some onion and a few sprigs of thyme from the garden and turn it into a supper that would have had the boys fighting over who got to scrape the bottom. They raised 4 kids in that farmhouse. 4. Preston was the oldest, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and quick with numbers before he could read. Then came Meredith, steady and quiet, the only one of them who ever remembered to thank her mother for anything. Then Garrett, who broke 3 bones before he turned 10 and never met a roof he did not want to climb. Then Sloane, the baby. Sloane with her brown eyes and her questions that had no answers. For a long time that house was loud. It was full. Doors banging open, boys chasing each other down the hallway. Arguments about who finished the last of the milk. Everett building a longer dining table every few years because the family kept outgrowing the one they had. Adeline used to say the walls of that house soaked up more noise than the hills outside. She said it as a complaint. She didn't know she would miss it one day. The children grew up the way children grow up, slowly, and then all at once. Preston left first. He was smart. Everybody said so and everybody was right. He tested into the business school at Chapel Hill, graduated near the top, and took a job at a bank in Charlotte that paid him more in his first year than Everett had earned in any 5 years of his life combined. Adeline cried for 2 full days after he packed up his car and drove down the mountain. Then she dried her eyes and started cooking for 5 instead of 6. Meredith married a man who worked in finance and moved to Atlanta. The wedding was in the backyard of the Briar Hollow house. Everett built the arbor himself from 2 pieces of dogwood. Meredith cried when she saw it. Her husband shook Everett's hand politely and looked at his watch. Garrett went to Houston. There was work on the oil fields and on the construction crews that kept spilling up around the refineries. And a man who was not afraid of heights could make 3 times what anyone in Briar Hollow could make doing the same. He said he would send money. He did sometimes. Sloane was the last. She was 20 when she met a young man who played guitar in a band that was going nowhere, and she followed him out to the Outer Banks. Everett drove her there in the pickup. They stopped once on the way for fried catfish. When he got back home without her, Adeline sat at the kitchen table for an hour before she could stand up. At first they called every week, sometimes more. Adeline would sit by the kitchen phone on Sunday evenings and wait for it to ring. She would start sitting there around 4, even though Preston never called before 7. She would fold dish towels she had already folded twice. She would sharpen pencils she did not need sharpened. Everett hovered nearby, pretending he did not care, pretending he was not counting the rings. The calls were short, but they were enough. "How are you, Mama?" "We're fine, honey. How's the weather down there?" "Hot as a furnace." "We miss you. Miss you too, Mama." Then the calls came every 2 weeks, then once a month, then holidays only, then not even that. Believe me, it did not happen overnight. It was slow, the way water wears down a stone. One month Preston forgot Adeline's birthday. She sat by the phone until 11 that night waiting. Everett told her he probably just got busy. She nodded. She did not believe him. Neither did he. Meredith stopped answering when Everett called on weekends. Her voicemail greeting was brisk and professional, like she was at work even on a Sunday. Garrett sent money twice a year. An envelope with cash and no letter, not even a sentence. Just bills folded in half. Sloane changed her phone number and did not tell them the new one for 3 months. Everett did not talk about it. That was not his way. He went out to his workshop behind the barn every morning and built things nobody needed. A birdhouse, a footstool, a picture frame with no picture in it, a small wooden box with a lid that fit so perfectly you could not see the seam. He kept his hands busy because if they stopped moving, his mind would start and his mind would go to dark places. Adeline talked about it. She talked about it to Everett. She talked about it to their neighbor Mabel Ashford, who lived half a mile down the road and had been Adeline's closest friend for more than 40 years. Mabel was 78 now, a widow herself with arthritis in both hips and a tongue that did not suffer fools. "They're busy," Adeline would say. "Preston's got a big job. Meredith's got the boys. Garrett, you know how he is." Mabel would say. "They call when they can." Mabel would say again. And Mabel would pour another cup of coffee and not say what she was thinking, because some things you do not say out loud to a friend, even when you have known her since she was a bride. Adeline made excuses the way a mother does when the truth is too ugly to hold in her hands. She told the woman at the farmer's market that her children were doing so well. She told the new preacher that Preston had just been promoted. She told herself most nights that things would get better, that one of them would remember, that next Sunday would be different. At night, sitting alone at a table set for two, she stopped making excuses. She just sat there. Sometimes out of habit, she would set 4 extra places. Then she would stare at the empty chairs until her coffee went cold. The house started falling apart the same way the family did. A leak in the roof right above the kitchen sink that Everett could not reach anymore because his knees were bad. He used to climb that roof without thinking about it. He had built half of it himself the winter Preston was 2 back when the old roof caved in during an ice storm. Now he stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked up and knew he could not make it. A crack in the wall by the back door that spread a little wider every winter. The garden gate rusted shut. The vegetable patch went to weeds because Adeline's back would not take the bending anymore. A shutter on the south side of the house came loose in an October wind and banged against the siding for 3 days before Everett gave up trying to fix it and just took it down. He called Preston. He let it ring a long time. He almost hung up. But he did not. "Dad, son, I was hoping we could talk about the house." There was a pause. In the background, a woman's voice said something Everett could not make out. "What about it?" "We need some help, the roof, a few other things." Another pause. "Dad, I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" He did not call back. Not that day, not that week. Everett tried again 2 weeks later. Preston did not answer. An hour later, a text came through on the old flip phone Adeline kept by the stove. It said, "Dad, I'm dealing with a lot right now." That was it. 5 words. Everett read it twice. He read it 3 times. Then he put the phone down on the kitchen counter, very carefully, the way a man sets down a thing that might break if he is not careful. He went out to his workshop. He did not come back until supper. That was the last time Everett Whitaker ever asked any of his children for help. Now here is where it gets hard, because what happened next was not one big betrayal. It was a series of small ones, the kind that add up so quietly you do not notice until you are standing in the wreckage. Preston had power of attorney over the family property. Everett had signed the papers 7 years earlier, back when he trusted his oldest son without question. He signed them the way a father does, not reading the fine print, not imagining a world where his own blood would use that paper against him. Adeline had been there that day. She had poured Preston a glass of iced tea while Everett signed. She had said she was proud of him for handling the family's affairs. She had thought she was handing responsibility to a man she raised. She was handing a weapon to a stranger. Here is what they did not know yet. 18 months before that Tuesday morning, Preston had signed a second document, a much more interesting document, a private side agreement with a company called Heartfelt Development, headquartered in a glass tower on Tryon Street in Charlotte. The agreement was not about an apartment complex. It was not about a strip mall. The agreement was about timber. Specifically about the virgin white oak and poplar and black walnut standing on a particular 160-acre parcel of Appalachian hillside in a county most people in Charlotte could not have found on a map. The agreement promised Preston Whitaker a 7-figure commission the day the first chainsaw touched the first tree. But we will come back to that. It was a Tuesday when the man in the hard hat knocked on the door. Adeline was canning the last of the tomatoes. Everett was on the porch sanding the lid of a small cedar box. The morning was warm for October. There were still hummingbirds at the feeder. The man was young, 25 maybe. He wore a yellow hard hat he had clearly forgotten to take off when he left the job site. He had a clipboard. "Mr. Whitaker, that's me." I'm with Hartwell Development, out of Charlotte. Everett set down his sandpaper. We're doing a site walk next week. Wanted to give you folks the courtesy of a heads up. A site walk for what, son? The young man looked at his clipboard. He looked at Everett. He looked back at his clipboard. The property, sir. I assumed you knew. The sale closed about 6 weeks ago. Everett did not speak. He did not move. Mr. Whitaker, your son signed the paperwork. You have 60 days to vacate. I'm real sorry, sir. I thought you knew. Adeline had come out onto the porch. She was holding a dish towel. She did not realize she was still holding it. Say that again. The young man said it again. He showed Everett the paperwork. He pointed at the signature line. It was Preston's signature. Everett knew his son's signature. He had seen it on birthday cards and on the back of a baseball signed by a player who had played for the Charlotte Hornets. It was Preston's. Everett sat down on the front step. He did not speak. He did not yell. He did not curse. He sat there with his hands on his knees, staring at the ground between his boots, and his face did not change. Adeline stood behind him. After a long moment, she put one hand on his shoulder. She squeezed once. That was all they had left. A squeeze on the shoulder and 60 days. They called all 4 children that night. Preston did not answer. Not at 7, not at 8, not at 10. By 11, the calls were going straight to voicemail. Adeline left 3 messages. Her voice was steady the first time. It was smaller the second. The third time she could not finish. Meredith picked up. She listened. She said she was sorry. She said it really was not her place to get involved. She said Preston had his reasons. She said she had to go. The baby was crying. Garrett did not pick up, but he called back the next morning from a job site in Texas with a sound in the background like a jackhammer. He said he would send more money. He said it 3 times like he was trying to convince himself. He said he had to get back to work. Sloane's number was disconnected. On day 59, Adeline climbed the narrow folding stairs up into the attic. She had not been up there in years. Her knees were bad and the stairs were steep, and there was nothing up there she needed. But she needed the photograph. The photograph of the 4 of them. Preston 8, Meredith 6, Garrett 3, Sloane still a baby in Adeline's arms, Everett standing behind her with one hand on her shoulder, the farmhouse in the background, blue sky, a dog named Rusty in the corner of the frame. She had taken it down from the wall years ago when a hinge on the frame broke, meaning to fix it, and never had. She wanted it. Whatever happened next, she wanted that picture. The attic was hot and smelled like cedar. Dust hung in the light from the single window. She found the frame in a cardboard box near the chimney. The glass was cracked in one corner. The photograph was a little faded. Her children's faces looked out at her from a world that did not exist anymore. She sat down on a wooden trunk and held the picture in her lap. And that was when she saw the letter. It was tucked into the back of the frame, folded into a narrow rectangle and slid in behind the cardboard backing. A corner of it stuck out, yellowed, almost invisible against the old brown of the board. She had held that frame 100 times over the years. She had never noticed. She pulled it out. The paper was brittle. The ink was faded. But the handwriting she recognized immediately, because it was the same handwriting as the signature on the deed Everett kept in the filing cabinet downstairs. The same handwriting as the note that had been pinned to the handle of the old handplane in Everett's workshop for as long as she had been in that house. A note that read in 7 careful words, "Use this one for the curved cuts." It was the handwriting of Silas Whitaker, Everett's father, who had died in a logging accident 30 years before. Adeline's hands began to shake. She unfolded the paper. The letter was addressed to Everett. It was dated 3 weeks before Silas died. "My boy," it began. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and the time has come for you to know what has been kept from you. There is a white oak past the ridge on the north face, the one they used to call the grandfather. You have seen it. You were 4 years old the first time I took you there. You will not remember, but you walked around the base of it with your hand on the bark, and you said it was a house. Son, it is a house. It has always been a house. It is our blood's promise. They will come for it one day. Men with papers, men with money. They came for me and I said no, and now you will see what saying no costs a man. I'm not afraid. But you must not let them take it. Not the tree, not the hollow inside it, not what is buried beneath the floor of that hollow which I placed there with my own hands, and which your great-grandmother placed there before me. When you need it, the tree will need you. You will know. Your father. Adeline read the letter 3 times. She sat on that wooden trunk in the hot dust of the attic with a cracked photograph in her lap and her dead father-in-law's letter in her trembling hands, and she did not move for a long time. Everett had never seen this letter. She knew him. She knew his face when he was keeping something in. He had never seen it. She thought about going downstairs and handing it to him. She did not. Something stopped her. She could not have said what it was. Call it instinct. Call it 46 years of marriage and the quiet, private knowledge that there are moments in a life when a wife carries a thing alone for a little while longer because the carrying is not yet finished. She folded the letter. She slid it into the pocket of her apron. She tucked the photograph under her arm, climbed down the attic stairs, one painful step at a time, and said nothing. Morning came the way mornings come. Gray at first, then gold. Everett packed his tools. He packed his good chisel and his handsaw and the small block plane that had been his father's. He packed 2 changes of clothes and a jacket for when the weather turned. He didn't pack much. He was a man who believed a man should be able to carry what he owned. Adeline packed the photograph. She packed 3 dresses and a wool coat. She packed a paring knife and 2 spoons. She packed the letter, still folded, still secret, in the inside pocket of her coat where it would lie against her ribs. And she packed the cast-iron pot. Everett looked at the pot when she set it by the door. He looked at her. Addie. I know. It's heavy. I know. We don't know where we're going. I know that too. He did not argue. He picked up the pot. They locked the farmhouse door. They set the key on the top step. Adeline put her hand flat against the wood of the door for a moment, the way a woman says goodbye to an animal she has loved. Then she turned and walked away and did not look back because she knew that if she looked back, she would not be able to leave. They walked through town. It was early. The diner was just opening. The old man who ran the post office was pulling up the blinds, and he waved through the glass without knowing where they were going or why. Adeline waved back because it would have been unkind not to. A few neighbors saw them go. Mabel Ashford was standing on her porch in her housecoat with a coffee cup in her hand, and she watched them walk past her drive without calling out. Her face, when Adeline glanced up, was the face of a woman who understood. Mabel did not ask where they were going. Mabel, Adeline would realize later, already knew where they were going, but that is a story for a little farther on. They walked along the county road until the pavement ran out. They walked along the gravel until the gravel ran out. They walked along the deer track that began where the gravel ended because Adeline's feet hurt and Everett's knees were bad and they had no car and no destination and nowhere in the world to be. They'd been walking maybe 2 hours when Adeline stopped. A narrow dirt trail split off from the deer track and disappeared into a thick stand of hemlock and rhododendron. It was barely a trail at all. You would have missed it if you had not been looking at exactly the right angle at exactly the right time. Adeline looked at it. Everett looked at her. Addie. She did not answer. She was thinking about a letter folded in the inside pocket of her coat. She was thinking about a ridge. She was thinking about the way her father-in-law had written, "The tree will need you. You will know." She thought, "I know." "This way," she said. Everett did not ask why. He followed her. The trail climbed. It got steeper. The brush closed in on both sides. The light got dimmer as the canopy thickened overhead. Adeline's lungs burned. Everett was breathing hard. The cast-iron pot dragged on his right arm like a stone. And then the trees opened up. They stepped into a clearing. The clearing was maybe 40 feet across. The ground was soft with centuries of fallen leaves. Sunlight came down in narrow shafts through gaps in the canopy and lit the forest floor in gold. And in the middle of it stood the tree. Everett stopped walking. Adeline stopped beside him. The tree was enormous. Not big, not large, enormous in a way that made the word tree feel like the wrong word. The trunk was wider than their farmhouse kitchen. The bark was deep gray and grooved with 1,000 years of weather. Roots the size of a man's body sprawled across the earth in every direction, humped and twisted like the backs of sleeping animals. It was a white oak, and it was old. It was so old that Adeline felt her breath catch in her throat the way a person's breath catches in a cathedral. At the base of the trunk on the side facing them, the bark split open into a vertical seam, a natural opening, just wide enough for a person to step through sideways. Everett made a sound she had not heard him make in 46 years. It was a small sound, half a word, half a breath. "Dad." Adeline turned to look at him. His face had gone white. "Addie, my daddy brought me here. I was 4, maybe 5. I'd forgotten. I'd completely forgotten. He brought me here and he walked me around the base of it and he said..." He stopped. He said what? He said it was a house. Adeline felt the letter against her ribs. She did not take it out. She did not say anything. She took her husband's rough, swollen hand in hers. She squeezed it once. Then she let go, and she walked forward through the ferns, and she put her hand on the bark of the opening, and she stepped through. She went first. Everett followed a moment later, ducking his head, turning his shoulders. Inside, the world changed. The hollow was wide. The space was tall. The floor was dry, packed earth, and it was level in a way that could not quite have been natural. The ceiling rose up into darkness, and somewhere far above, a few gaps in the bark, let in threads of daylight that fell in pale, narrow beams, like the light inside an old country church. The air smelled of earth and wood, and something green and cold like moss after rain. Adeline turned in a slow circle. Her eyes filled. She did not cry. She had not cried in months, but her eyes filled and she did not wipe them. Everett set the cast-iron pot down in the middle of the hollow. It made a dull sound against the packed earth. "Well," he said, "just that. One word." She looked at him. He looked at her. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Adeline Whittaker smiled. The first night they slept on the ground, curled together inside the hollow, with the wool coat spread over them and the pot between their feet. It was cold. The ground was hard. Everett's hip hurt and Adeline's back hurt, and the forest outside was loud with things that moved in the dark. But nobody could come take it from them. Nobody had sold it. Nobody had signed a paper. Nobody in Charlotte knew it existed. That was the first thing Adeline thought, lying there in the dark with her husband's breath steady against her hair. The second thing she thought was more dangerous. She thought, "This place has been waiting for us." The second morning, Everett unpacked his tools. He did not say anything. He just opened his canvas roll and laid out his chisels and his hand plane, and his small crosscut saw, and his hammer in a neat row on a flat stone near the opening. Then he took off his jacket. Then he rolled up his sleeves. Then he started to work. He worked the way he had always worked, slow, patient, every cut deliberate. He shaped a shelf into a curve of the inner wall just above shoulder height, deep enough to hold a jar. He didn't chip the living wood. He worked with the grain. He listened to the tree the way he had listened to every piece of wood he had ever touched. Adeline went out into the clearing. She gathered moss. She gathered dry grass. She found a patch of wild mint growing by a little spring about 200 yards north of the clearing, and she cupped the leaves in her hands and smelled them and almost laughed. She hung the photograph on a carved notch Everett made for her low on the inner wall where she could see it from where she would sleep. 4 small faces, a farmhouse, a dog named Rusty. She set the cast iron pot on a fire ring she built from flat river stones just outside the opening. She lit a small fire with dry twigs and a match from Everett's coat pocket. She boiled water from the spring. She dropped in the wild mint. She poured the tea into 2 tin cups. She handed one to Everett. He drank. He looked at her over the rim. "Addie." "Yes." "How did you know to turn up that trail?" She thought about the letter. It was still folded inside her coat. She could feel it against her ribs. She thought, "I will tell him. Not today. Soon. I just knew," she said. He nodded. He didn't push. He went back to his shelf. The days turned into a week. The week turned into 2. Everett built a table from a fallen limb he sanded smooth. He carved 2 chairs, each one shaped to fit the curve of the inner wall. He cut a door from a wide slab of shed bark and hung it on wooden hinges he whittled by hand. Adeline wove a rug from dried reeds she pulled from the spring. She sewed a curtain from her wool coat lining for a small window. Everett carved through a thin section of trunk. And then on the 10th day, Adeline noticed the mark. She had been sweeping the floor of the hollow with a broom of tied pine needles. The swept dirt was fine and dry. She was sweeping around the base of the south wall when she knocked loose a crust of old moss, and something underneath it caught her eye. She crouched down. Her knees popped. She ignored them. There at the base of the wall, deep in a fold of bark where no living eye had looked in decades, a small shape was carved into the wood. A cross. A simple Christian cross no bigger than her thumb. The cuts were old. The edges were weathered smooth. But the cross was unmistakable, and it was deliberate, and whoever had carved it had known what they were doing. Adeline stared at it for a long time. Then she looked at the floor. She swept again. The dirt moved. And under the dirt, almost flush with the packed earth, she felt with the tip of the broom something hard, something flat, something that did not belong in the floor of a tree. She knelt all the way down. She put her hand against it. It was metal, cold. She did not call Everett. She got the smallest chisel from his tool roll and she dug slowly, carefully around the edges. The earth came up, and what came up with it was a tin box about the size of a family Bible green, with age sealed at the seams with wax that had long since cracked. Her hands were shaking. She sat down on the floor. She pulled the lid. The lid came free with a small, reluctant sigh of old air. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 things. A deed. The original deed to the Whitaker property, dated 1871, with a line at the bottom. Adeline's eyes skimmed once and then went back to and read again more slowly because the language was legal and she was a farmer's wife, not a lawyer. A handwritten will dated 1897, signed by a woman named Eliza Whitaker, Everett's great-grandmother. And a heavy cream-colored document 40 pages long, bound in cracked leather with a brass clasp and a ribbon. The first page read in faded but legible ink, "The Whitaker Family Trust, established the 15th of March, 1897. Adeline turned the pages. She could not read fast. Her eyes were old. But she could read, and she read the words that mattered, and the words that mattered said this: "The 200 acres of virgin hardwood forest surrounding and including the grandfather oak, so called on the north ridge of the Whitaker homestead, were held in trust. in perpetuity. The timber on that land could not be cut. The land could not be sold. No heir could transfer mortgage or convey any part of it without the signed and notarized consent of every living descendant of Eliza Whittaker. Everyone. Adeline sat on the packed earth floor of the hollow of a 400-year-old white oak with her dead great-mother-in-law's trust document trembling in her hands, and she understood two things at once. The first was that Preston's sale of the land was not legal. It had never been legal. Whatever he had signed with Hartwell Development was not worth the paper it was printed on. The second was more dangerous. Silas Whittaker had known about this trust. Silas had placed this box here himself. Silas had written a letter to his son saying they will come for it. They came for me, you must not let them take it. And 3 weeks after writing that letter, Silas had died in what everyone in Briar Hollow had been told was a logging accident. Adeline closed the box. She wrapped it back in its oilcloth. She slid it into a hollow beneath a root she had not noticed before, pressed against the inner wall of the tree. She covered it with dirt. She swept the dirt smooth. She stood up slowly, holding the small of her back. That evening she cooked supper in the cast-iron pot. Stew meat Mabel had quietly pressed into her hands the morning they left, which Adeline had not mentioned. Potatoes from the roots of a wild plant she had identified by the spring. An onion, one of Mabel's grandchildren, had left at the edge of the clearing 2 days ago, wrapped in a scrap of brown paper, tied with string. No note. Adeline had pretended not to see it until Mabel's grandson had gone, and then she had picked it up and carried it inside. Everett came in from his work. He washed his hands in a bowl of spring water. He sat down at the little table he had built. She set a plate in front of him. He looked at her. "Addie, you've been quiet today. Have I? Something on your mind?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter in her coat. She thought about the tin box under the root. She thought about what a woman tells her husband and when. Not tonight, she thought. Tomorrow, or the day after. Let him have this one meal in peace. "Just tired," she said. He nodded. He ate. After supper, she lit the first real candle she had made from beeswax. A man at a little country store had sold her on a walk into the next valley for a bar of her homemade soap. The candle sat on one of Everett's carved shelves. The flame was small. The light was warm and gold. It threw long, soft shadows against the inside of the tree, against the curtain, against the photograph of 4 small faces that did not know what their oldest brother had done or what their great-great-grandmother had written 129 years ago in ink that had not faded. Everett went outside to bank the fire. Adeline sat alone on the floor of the hollow in the warm gold light, and for the second time in as many weeks she smiled. She didn't know yet that a young photographer named Jasper Holt was at that very moment 30 miles away in a motel off the interstate, plotting a hike into these same woods to photograph a rare warbler that had been seen on this ridge for the first time in 40 years. She did not know that her oldest son was at that very moment in a corner office on the 27th floor of a glass tower on Tryon Street, signing an addendum that would, in the space of 60 more days, authorize the first survey crews to enter the north face of a certain ridge, in a certain small county, clipboards in hand, tape measures on their belts, looking for a certain tree. She did not know that Mabel Ashford, her closest friend in the world, was sitting up late in her own kitchen, half a mile down the county road, with a cup of chamomile tea, gone cold, and an old leather-bound diary open in front of her on the oilcloth, and a pen in her hand that had not quite managed to write anything yet. Adeline did not know any of this, but the tree knew, and soon enough she would know too. The weeks that followed taught Adeline Whittaker something she had not expected to learn at 68 years old. A home is not a building. A home is the thing you make with the person you love in whatever shape the world leaves you. The hollow of the grandfather oak became a home, not a shelter, not a hiding place, a home. Everett worked every morning from first light until the sun climbed above the ridge. He moved slower than he had as a younger man. His hands hurt more by the end of each day, but something in him had come awake again, and Adeline saw it in the way he stood back from a shelf he had just finished and looked at it for a long moment before he nodded and moved on to the next one. He built a low bed frame along the curve of the inner wall. He layered it with moss and with soft strips of cedar bark. Adeline pulled from fallen limbs. It was, Adeline said, the most comfortable bed she had slept on in 30 years. Everett said she was being kind. Adeline said she was being honest. He carved a line into the beam above the bed, a thin groove in the wood, and she asked him what it was for. Measuring, he said. Measuring what? How tall we get as we grow old together. She laughed. It surprised her. The laugh came out of her like a bird off a branch, quick and startled and then gone. She had not laughed like that in years. She built a cooking space just outside the entrance, a ring of flat river stones for the fire, a small lean-to of woven branches to keep the rain off the firewood, a line of thin wooden pegs Everett hammered into the outer bark from which she hung bundles of drying herbs, sage, thyme, wild mint, rosemary from a cutting Mabel had once given her, which she had carried in a wet rag in her coat pocket on the day they left the farmhouse, and which had taken root in a patch of earth by the spring within a week. She hung the photograph of the 4 children in the place she had chosen on the first day, low on the inner wall, where her eye would find it when she woke. Some mornings she looked at that picture and she felt the old ache, the long, slow ache that had lived in her chest for the better part of a decade. Some mornings the ache was quieter. Some mornings it was almost gone. And some mornings, lying in the soft dark of the hollow with her husband's slow breath beside her, she thought about the tin box under the root, and she was afraid. She had not told Everett about the box. She had not told him about the letter. She could not have said exactly why. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She told herself a man his age did not need the shock of learning that his father had probably been killed by the same company that was now trying to kill what was left of his family. She told herself she was protecting him. Some of that was true. Some of it was something else. Some of it was the dawning private knowledge that Adeline Whittaker was for the first time in her long life holding a weapon in her hands. A real weapon. And a weapon, she understood, was a thing a woman does not hand to her husband. It is a thing a woman chooses herself when and how to use. She was not ready to choose yet. So she cooked, she gathered, she wove, she waited. The clearing around the tree changed as autumn turned toward winter. The poplars went yellow. The maples went red and orange, so bright against the gray of the oak that some mornings the whole clearing looked like it was burning. The air got colder. The nights got longer. Everett built a small iron stove inside the hollow from parts he and Adeline carried up the trail over the course of 3 trips to a junk shop in the next town, over 6 miles walk each way, 6 miles back, and he ran a stovepipe up through a small hole he cut through the bark high in the hollow where a natural gap already let smoke escape. The stove was crude. The stovepipe leaked a little, but the hollow got warm. And on the first truly cold night, the first night Adeline could see her breath in the afternoon, she lay awake in the gold light of a single candle in the warm, dry air of a stove she had helped build, and she understood that she was not going to die of cold. Not this winter. Not in this house. The nights turned long. Everett whittled by firelight. Adeline darned socks. They drank tea from tin cups. They talked sometimes for hours about things they had not talked about in years. Preston's first day of school. The time Garrett had fallen out of the hayloft and broken his arm and lied about it for a week before Adeline noticed he was not using his right hand. The year Meredith had brought home a stray cat and named it Dr. Jenkins for reasons she had never been able to explain. The afternoon Sloane at 5 had announced to a church full of people that she was going to marry her father, which had made the whole congregation laugh, except for Adeline, who had seen the small, proud face of her youngest and had understood suddenly and for the first time how much a child can love a parent who has not yet done anything to deserve it. They did not talk about what had happened. They did not talk about the 60 days. They did not talk about Preston. They did not talk about the man in the charcoal suit who had walked to a black sedan and driven away without looking back. Not yet. Winter came. A soft snow fell one morning in early December. Adeline stepped outside the hollow and stood with her hands in the pockets of her wool coat and watched the flakes come down through the bare branches of the oak. The forest was silent in the way only a snowy forest is silent, like the world was holding its breath and remembering something important. She was standing there when she heard the branch snap. She turned her head. A young man was standing at the edge of the clearing. He was maybe 30. He wore a heavy green jacket and a wool cap, a backpack on his shoulders, a camera around his neck. His breath was visible in the cold air. He had stopped walking because he had seen her, and now he was standing perfectly still, the way a man stands when he is not sure whether to step forward or to step back. He was staring past her. He was staring at the tree, at the door, at the thin line of wood smoke rising from the stovepipe and curling up into the snowy sky. Adeline did not move. The young man did not move. Then he spoke. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't know anybody lived up here." His voice was surprisingly gentle. A Virginia accent, she thought. Maybe Piedmont. Not a local boy. She watched him. She did not answer. He raised both his hands slowly, palms out. "My name is Jasper Holt. I'm a photographer. I've been tracking a warbler, a cerulean. It's endangered. A birder over in Boone sent me coordinates. I didn't mean to trespass. I'll turn around right now if you want me to." Adeline looked at him for a long moment. He was telling the truth. She was a woman who had raised 4 children, and she knew the difference between a boy with a lie in his mouth and a boy without one. Everett came out behind her. He had heard the voice. He had his plane in his hand still. He stood in the doorway of the tree with his gray hair uncombed and his flannel shirt open at the collar, and he looked at the young man and then at Adeline. "Addie." She made her choice. Later she would wonder whether she made it in that exact moment standing in the snow, or whether she had made it days earlier, or years earlier, or whether her whole life had been aiming her toward this one small decision. "Come in," she said to the young man. "Get warm." Jasper Holt stepped into the hollow of the grandfather oak and stopped moving for a full minute. He just stood there. His jaw was slightly open. He turned very slowly in a full circle. He looked at the shelves. He looked at the curtain. He looked at the cast iron stove. He looked at the table and at the 2 carved chairs. He looked at the cracked photograph low on the inner wall. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Who built this?" "My husband," Adeline said. "All of it. All of it." Jasper sat down at the table. Adeline poured him tea in a tin cup. Everett, who was not a man who warmed quickly to strangers, sat down across from him and watched him the way an old dog watches a new one in the yard. Jasper drank. He set the cup down. His hands were shaking a little from the cold from something else. He said, "I take photographs for a living, mostly wildlife. Sometimes when I find a place that moves me, I take photographs of the place. I would like very much to take photographs of this, of the tree, of what you've done inside it, if you would let me." Everett looked at Adeline. Adeline looked at Everett. 46 years of marriage is a long conversation without words. Everett saw her answer in the set of her shoulders. He nodded once. "Take your pictures, son," Everett said. Jasper stayed for 3 hours. He took hundreds of photographs. He moved slowly, respectfully, the way a man moves in a church. He photographed the shelves. He photographed the curtain Adeline had sewn from her wool coat lining. He photographed the cast-iron pot on the fire ring outside. He photographed the cracked family picture on the inner wall. He photographed Everett's hands with their scars and their swollen knuckles holding the small block plane that had belonged to his father. He photographed Adeline by the stove with her white hair pulled back and her steady gray eyes looking just past the camera. And he didn't tell her, because she didn't seem like a woman who wanted to hear it, that she had the most dignified face he had ever photographed in his life. When he was done, he sat back down at the table. He accepted a second cup of tea. He said, "Can I ask how you came to be here?" Adeline told him. Not everything. She did not tell him about the letter. She did not tell him about the tin box. She did not tell him about Silas Whitaker or the grandfather oak or the family trust or the signature line on the deed. She told him only the public part. The part anyone in Briar Hollow could have told him. 4 children. A sale. 60 days. A walk into the woods. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "Mrs. Whitaker, this is the most beautiful home I have ever seen, and I've seen a lot of homes." He left before dark. He took nothing with him but his photographs. At the edge of the clearing, he turned back and lifted one hand. Adeline raised one hand in return. The snow was falling again. That night, Everett asked her whether she had done the right thing letting him in. "Yes," she said. She did not say more. She did not yet know whether she was right. She only knew that something had turned, and there was no turning it back. 4 days later, Jasper Holt posted the photographs online. He did not use their real names. He did not say exactly where the tree was, only that it was somewhere in the southern Appalachians. He wrote a short piece, 200 words, about an elderly couple he had met by accident in the deep woods, and about the home they had built with their own hands after they had been driven out of their old one by their children. The photographs did the rest. Within 3 days, the story had been shared 100,000 times. Within a week, it was in the Charlotte Observer, then the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, then the Washington Post. A television crew from an affiliate in Greensboro drove up into the mountains and spent 2 days looking for the tree, and did not find it because Jasper Holt had been very careful about what he had and had not said. The comment sections filled up with strangers arguing about family and duty and what children owe their parents. Some of the comments were angry. Some of them were grieving. A great many of them were from men and women in late middle age who wrote in one form or another about their own parents, their own regrets, their own small betrayals that they had never quite admitted to themselves until they had seen a photograph of a cast-iron pot on a fire ring outside the hollow of an ancient tree. Adeline and Everett knew none of this. They were in a forest with no phone and no electricity, and they would not have known if the moon had fallen out of the sky. But Preston Whitaker knew. Preston was sitting in his corner office on the 27th floor of a glass tower on Tryon Street in Charlotte when a junior associate sent him the link. The junior associate did not know the couple in the photographs were Preston's parents. Nobody at the bank knew. Preston did not talk about his family. He was, in fact, at that exact moment, eating a $16 chopped salad at his desk and reviewing the addendum that would authorize the first survey team to enter the north face of a certain ridge in a certain small county the following Monday morning. He clicked the link. He saw the photograph of the cast-iron pot first. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He recognized the pot. He had knocked it off the stove when he was 6 years old. His mother had yelled at him the only time he ever remembered her yelling, and then she had picked him up and held him while he cried, and she had said it was all right. The pot was fine. The pot had fed his great-grandmother and her grandmother before her, and a dented side was nothing to be afraid of. He scrolled. He saw the photograph of the 4 children on the inner wall. He saw himself, 8 years old, a dog named Rusty, his father's hand on his mother's shoulder, the farmhouse in the background. Then he saw the tree. Preston went very still. He was not breathing. A man in his position has trained himself to see what other men miss. A man in his position has trained himself to recognize opportunity in a single photograph. And Preston Whitaker, looking at a single wide-angle shot of the exterior of the grandfather oak, understood 3 things in the space of about 2 seconds. The first thing he understood was that the tree in the photograph was a virgin white oak of extraordinary size. The second thing he understood was that the tree in the photograph stood on the north face of a certain ridge in a certain small county within a particular 160-acre parcel, whose timber rights he had privately pledged to Hartwell Development 18 months earlier in exchange for a 7-figure commission payable the day the first chainsaw touched the first tree. The third thing he understood was that his parents, whom he had not visited in 4 years, were living inside the very tree that he had on paper sold. His face did not change. His assistant, who was standing in the doorway waiting for him to sign something, thought later that his face had gone a little pale. But then she had always thought Preston Whitaker looked pale. He was the kind of man who did not see much sunlight. He reached for his phone. He called Meredith first. She picked up on the second ring. She had already seen the article. She was crying. She had been crying for an hour. Meredith had always been the softest of the 4. She had been the one to apologize at Thanksgiving dinners for things she had not done, the one to cry at weddings and funerals and long-distance phone commercials. She said, "Preston, that is Mama and Daddy. I know. What are we going to do?" "I don't know yet. Don't do anything until I call you back." He called Garrett. Garrett was on a scaffolding in Houston and had to climb down to take the call. Garrett had not seen the article yet. Preston told him about it in the flat, even voice he used with clients. Garrett was silent on the line for a long time. Then Garrett said, "Preston, tell me you didn't know where they were." "I didn't know where they were." This was technically true. Preston had not known the day the man in the hard hat had knocked on the farmhouse door exactly where his parents would end up. He had assumed an apartment. He had assumed a spare room at Mabel Ashford's. He had not assumed a tree. Sloane he could not reach. Her phone went to voicemail. It had been going to voicemail for more than a year. He ended that call. He sat in his office with the afternoon light falling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he looked at the photograph of the grandfather oak on his computer screen for a long time, and in the quiet place where a different man might have felt shame, Preston Whitaker did his arithmetic. He had 60 days before the first survey team entered those woods. He had a little less than that before the story faded from the news and the attention of strangers turned to something else. He decided to be seen. He needed, more importantly, to be seen going up that ridge. He picked up his phone again and called Meredith back. "We're going up there, all 4 of us. You, me, Garrett, and Sloane, if we can find her, this weekend. I'll arrange everything." "Preston, we should just call them. Send a car. We don't need to." "Meredith, listen to me. Half the country is watching this story. Do you want our names on that comment section? Do you want your boys to grow up hearing their mother was the sister in that story?" There was a long pause on Meredith's end. "No." "Then we go. We go together. We bring them home. We do it on camera if we have to. Understand?" She understood. 2 mornings later, a black SUV pulled up at the end of the gravel road in Briar Hollow. 4 people got out. A man in a charcoal suit, a woman in a navy coat who had been crying so long her face was puffy, a broad-shouldered man in jeans and a Carhartt jacket who looked around the valley like he had not remembered until that moment how green his own childhood had been. And one day, late but there, a tall, thin young woman in a black parka with her dark hair tied back under a wool cap who had flown in on the red-eye from the coast and who had not said more than 10 words to any of her siblings in nearly a year. They hired a local man to guide them up the trail. The local man was a quiet boy of about 20 who had grown up on a nearby farm and had read the article like everyone else. He did not tell them that Mabel Ashford had 2 evenings before told him very clearly that if he ever took strangers up that ridge without her say-so, he would not work another day in this county. He was not taking strangers up that ridge. He was taking the children of Everett Whitaker. That he judged was a different matter. He led them up the deer track. He led them up the narrow dirt trail that split off from it. The morning was cold and clear. The ground was hard with a light crust of old snow. They walked for nearly an hour. When they stepped into the clearing, all 4 of them stopped at once. The tree was enormous. Garrett said, "Good Lord." Meredith started crying again. Sloan did not make a sound. Preston, who had seen photographs of the tree for 3 days, was still not prepared for the size of it in person. The scale of the thing rearranged something in a man's head. He forced himself to look at the door instead. The door was closed. A thin line of smoke curled up from a stovepipe high above. Preston stepped forward. He raised his hand. He knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder. The door opened. Adeline Whitaker stood in the doorway of the hollow of the grandfather oak. Her white hair was pulled back. Her gray eyes were clear. Her hands, rough from months of forest living, hung at her sides. She wore an old flannel shirt of Everett's over a homespun dress and a wool shawl across her shoulders. She looked at her eldest son. She did not smile. She did not cry. She did not throw her arms around him. She only looked at him. Preston was surprised to find that he could not quite meet her eyes. He had prepared a speech. He had prepared it in the car on the way up the mountain. It was the kind of speech a man like Preston prepared. Warm, decisive, lightly apologetic, concluding with a suggestion and a plan. It all went out of his head. "Mom," he said, "we've come to take you home." Adeline looked at him. She looked at Meredith, who was crying. She looked at Garrett, who was looking at the ground. She looked at Sloan, who was standing at the back of the group, her arms wrapped tight around herself, her face unreadable. Adeline Whitaker said very quietly 5 words. "I am home." Preston took half a step back. He had not expected that. Everett appeared behind Adeline in the doorway. He was thinner than they remembered. His gray hair was longer. But he stood straight, and his eyes were steady, and when he looked at each of his children one at a time, slowly the way a man does when he is choosing what to say and what not to say, all 4 of them felt for a moment the way they had felt as small children when they had done something wrong. Everett said, "You sold our land." Nobody answered. "You stopped calling. You forgot we existed. And you are here now because strangers on the internet shamed you into coming." A long silence. Meredith whispered, "Daddy, No, let me finish." She closed her mouth. Everett turned to look at Adeline. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned back. "We didn't build this place because we wanted to live in a tree. We built it because we had no choice. You left us no choice. And then something happened that we did not expect. We found something here we had lost a long time ago. We found each other. We found quiet. We found a reason to get up in the morning, and we are not giving that up because you feel guilty." Preston had composed himself. He stepped forward. Dad, Mom, with respect, you can't live like this. There's no running water up here. There's no doctor. Winter is going to get worse. We can set you up anywhere. A nice place in Charlotte. A guest suite in my house. We have the money. Let us take care of you. Adeline looked at her oldest son. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "What would we do in your guest suite, Preston?" "You would." "You would what?" "Would we sit in a room and watch television? Would we eat dinner alone at 7 because you're still at the office? Would we wait for our grandchildren to visit, and would they not come because they don't know us, because you never brought them here? Tell me, what would we do in your guest suite?" Preston did not answer. Sloane moved. She stepped past her brothers and her sister without looking at any of them. She walked up to the opening in the trunk of the grandfather oak. She bent her head. She stepped inside. She was in there for a long time. When she came out, her face was wet. She stood in the doorway. She did not look at Preston. She looked only at her mother. "Mama," Sloane said. Her voice cracked in the middle of the word. "It's beautiful." That was the moment the wall broke. Meredith sat down on a fallen log and put her face in her hands and wept in a way she had not wept since she was a teenager. Garrett, a man who had not cried in 20 years, turned away and rubbed at his eyes with the back of one thick wrist. Preston stood apart. His jaw was tight. His hands were deep in the pockets of his coat. He was doing arithmetic again. He understood in that moment that the soft approach was not going to work. His mother was not coming down the mountain. His father was not coming down the mountain. And every day they stayed in that tree, the closer the Monday came when the survey crews would find them standing in the middle of a $90 million timber deal. He needed a harder approach. He let none of this show on his face. "Mama," he said, "Daddy, we'll leave you tonight. We'll think about it. We'll come back." Adeline looked at him. She saw him. She did not say what she saw. They went down the mountain before dark. The local boy led them. Meredith held Sloane's hand on the walk back. Garrett walked ahead with his shoulders hunched. Preston walked last, and he didn't look at the trees. That night in the Briar Hollow Inn, Sloane sat on the edge of her bed with her phone in her hand for a long time. She did not call anyone. She did not open any messages. She opened instead a particular folder on a particular cloud service she had been adding files to very quietly for 6 months. She looked at the files. She closed the folder. Not yet, she thought. Soon. At the same hour in her farmhouse, half a mile down the county road, Mabel Ashford finished writing in her diary by the light of a single kitchen lamp. She had, over the course of 3 evenings, copied out by hand a long series of entries that she had been adding to for 30 years. Her handwriting was small and careful. Her hips hurt. Her eyes were tired. She closed the book. She tied it shut with a length of brown twine. She put on her coat and her hat and her heavy boots, and she walked out into the cold night, and she walked the half-mile down the county road, and then another 2 miles up the gravel, and then the deer track, very slowly stopping twice to catch her breath, carrying her diary in a canvas shoulder bag. It was after midnight when Mabel Ashford reached the edge of the clearing. She did not call out. She simply stood there in the starlight in the dry cold of a Blue Ridge winter night until Adeline, who had always been a light sleeper, sensed something and came to the door of the hollow with a candle in her hand. The 2 women looked at each other across the snowy ground. Mabel walked forward. She took the diary out of her bag. She pressed it into Adeline's hands. "Addie." "Mabel, what?" "Read it. Tomorrow. Not tonight. And when you're done, Addie, you ask yourself who signed the logging permits in the county clerk's office in the spring of 1995, the year Silas died. You ask who held a timber option on that north ridge, and after you know, you burn this book. You hear me? You burn it." Mabel, I should have told you a long time ago. I couldn't. I was afraid. I'm an old woman now, Adeline. I'm more afraid of dying without saying it than I am of saying it. Don't ask me anything else. Not tonight. Mabel turned around. She walked back across the clearing. She disappeared into the trees. Adeline stood in the doorway with the diary in her hands and the candle guttering in the cold air. And she looked at the weight of what she had just been given, and she understood without having to open it that the thing she had been waiting for had arrived. The next morning, when Everett went out to split wood, she opened the diary. Mabel had copied everything: dates, names, accounts of conversations Mabel had overheard in the Briar Hollow Diner in the early 90s. A recollection written in Mabel's careful hand of a visit Silas Whitaker had paid to Mabel's late husband in February of 1995, in which Silas had said plainly that a company called Hartwell Development had been pressuring him for 2 years to sell the timber rights on the North Ridge, and that Silas had refused, and that Silas had been followed home from the diner twice that month by a black car with Charlotte plates. There was a copy of a newspaper article about Silas's death: logging accident, a falling limb, no witnesses. The official report was 2 paragraphs long. There was a name on the logging permit: a man named Lowell Deacon. Mabel had written in the margin, Hartwell site foreman 1995, died of a stroke 2004, never spoke of it. There was a photograph folded in the back, creased from long keeping. A grainy picture of 3 men on a job site in what looked like the spring. Mabel had labeled the back in pencil, Silas W. Lowell D., and a third man in a dark suit. The third man was young, tall, clean-shaven, wearing an expensive watch. Adeline held the photograph under the candle. She recognized the watch. It was the same watch her oldest son had been wearing the day before. She understood then all of it. This was not a story about a family that had gone wrong. This was a story that had started before Preston was born. This was a story that had buried Silas Whitaker under a falling limb in the spring of 1995. This was a story in which her son, her firstborn, was not an accidental villain, but a second generation of the same crime, working for the same company, committing the same theft against his own blood. Adeline sat on the floor of the hollow for a long time. She did not cry. She stood up. She closed the diary. She wrapped it in oilcloth. She slid it into the hollow beneath the root next to the tin box, and she covered it with dirt, and she swept the dirt smooth. That evening, when Everett came in and washed his hands in the bowl of spring water and sat down at the little table and looked at her, he saw something in her face that he had not seen in 46 years of marriage. "Addie, eat your supper, Everett. Adeline Whitaker, what has happened?" She looked at her husband. She thought about the letter folded in her coat. She thought about the tin box. She thought about Mabel's diary. She thought about the third man in the grainy photograph, and she thought about the watch on her son's wrist. She thought, not yet. One more day. "Nothing has happened," she said. "Eat your supper." He ate his supper. She watched him eat. She thought about what would happen when Preston came back up the mountain. She was certain he would come back. She had seen him do the arithmetic on his face. A man like Preston did not come all the way up a mountain and then walk away because his mother had said she was home. He would come back. He would come back with something in his hand. A paper, a lawyer, a judge's order, something. She did not know yet what he would bring. She only knew that when he did, she would be ready. That night, for the first time in many weeks, Adeline Whitaker did not sleep. She lay on the moss and cedar bed in the warm, dry hollow of the grandfather oak, with her husband's slow breath beside her and her photograph of 4 small faces on the inner wall. And she listened to the cold wind outside and thought about her dead father-in-law's letter and about a tin box full of 129-year-old paper. and about a diary full of names, and about a watch she had last seen in a photograph from the spring of 1995. And she understood that her waiting was almost over. Somewhere down in Charlotte, her oldest son was also awake. Preston Whitaker sat at the desk in his corner office on the 27th floor. His suit jacket was off. His tie was loose. A single lamp burned on his desk. The city below was lit up in long blue lines. His assistant had gone home. The building was nearly empty. In front of him was a document his personal attorney had drafted at his request over the past 48 hours, very quickly, with a great deal of discretion for a very high fee. The document was a petition. The petition asked a county court in North Carolina to declare Everett and Adeline Whitaker, ages 70 and 68, mentally and physically incapable of caring for themselves, and to appoint their eldest son, Preston Whitaker, as their legal guardian. He read the petition through twice. His hand did not shake when he signed it. He slid the document into a heavy envelope. He sealed the envelope. He set it at the corner of his desk where his courier would pick it up at 7 in the morning and deliver it to the county courthouse in Briar Hollow, where a judge would see it by 9. He looked at the envelope for a long time. Then he turned out the lamp and sat alone in his dark office on the 27th floor of a glass tower on Tryon Street in the city, where he had made himself into something his parents would not have recognized, and he thought about a cast iron pot on a fire ring outside the hollow of an ancient tree, and he felt nothing at all. 200 miles north, up in the cold, still silence of the Blue Ridge, Adeline Whitaker finally closed her eyes. She did not know about the envelope. She only knew that tomorrow was coming and that she was ready. Morning came gray and cold to the ridge. A thin frost lay over the ferns in the clearing. The fire in the ring outside the hollow was down to pale ash and a single orange heart. Somewhere up in the bare branches of a sycamore, a crow called once, and the sound carried across the snow like a thrown stone. Adeline Whitaker was already awake. She had been awake since before the first light. She had risen quietly from the moss and cedar bed. She had dressed in the gray wool dress Mabel had given her at Christmas 6 years earlier. She had pulled her white hair back and pinned it at the nape of her neck the way her own mother had always pinned hers. She had laced her boots. She had looked at her sleeping husband for a long moment in the soft dark, and she had felt the deep, settled love she had felt for him every morning of their 46 years together, and she had not woken him. She had gone outside. She had built the fire up. She had set water to boil. She had taken the tin box out from beneath the root. She had taken the diary out from beneath the root. She had laid them both on the small carved table, and she had sat down at the table, and she had waited. She did not know exactly what was coming, but she knew that something was coming. She had known it since the moment she had looked at the watch on her son's wrist. At a little after 8, she heard the first footsteps on the trail. She did not get up. The footsteps came up through the hemlock and the rhododendron. Voices. More than one man. Boots on frozen ground. She counted. 4, maybe 5. Maybe. Everett came awake at the sound. He sat up on the edge of the bed. He looked at her across the hollow. He saw her sitting at the table. He saw the tin box. He saw the diary. Addie. I know Everett. Addie, what is that? Get dressed, she said. Please, quickly. He didn't argue. He dressed. His hands fumbled on the buttons of his flannel. His knees cracked when he stood. They stepped outside together. Preston was at the edge of the clearing. He was in a long wool overcoat, expensive, charcoal. His polished shoes were wet with snow. Behind him stood a man Adeline did not know, middle-aged, a black briefcase, a lawyer's face. Behind the lawyer stood a younger man in a dark parka holding a clipboard. Behind the younger man stood a uniformed deputy sheriff who looked like he would rather have been anywhere else on a Tuesday morning in December, and who was not looking at the tree, but at his own boots. And behind all of them, standing a little apart, stood Meredith and Garrett and Sloane. The three of them had not been expecting this. You could see it on their faces. Preston walked forward. He stopped about 15 feet from the opening of the tree. "Mom, Dad, I'm not here to argue." He reached into his coat. He took out a folded envelope. He held it up. "This is a petition. It was filed yesterday afternoon in the county courthouse. A judge signed an emergency order this morning. The state of North Carolina has determined that given your age, your living conditions, and the testimony of a licensed physician, you are both no longer competent to make decisions about your own care or your own property. I have been appointed your legal guardian on an emergency temporary basis. Pending a hearing next month, I have the authority to move you to a safer environment and to act on your behalf in all legal and financial matters." Meredith made a sound in her throat like a small animal. Sloane's face did not change. Her hand moved slowly into the inside pocket of her parka. Garrett took one step forward and stopped because he did not know what to do with his hands. Preston kept his voice level. He had practiced this in the car. "Mom, I'm sorry. I know this is hard. But look at where you are. Look at this. You have an iron stove in a tree. Dad is 70 years old. Winter is coming. This is not safe. This is not rational. I am trying to protect you." Adeline Whitaker looked at her oldest son. She looked at him for a long time. Everett started to speak. Adeline put one hand on his arm, the smallest pressure. He stopped. "Preston," Adeline said. "Yes, Mom." "Come inside with your lawyer. I have something to show you." Preston blinked. Whatever he had been expecting, it was not that. "Mom, we don't need." "Come inside, Preston. You too, sir. Deputy, I believe you have every right to come in as well as a witness. The rest of you, Meredith, Garrett, Sloane, please, all of you, come inside." She turned. She walked into the hollow of the tree. They followed her. There was not room for all of them. The hollow was warm from the stove. The candle on the shelf was lit, though it was morning because Adeline had lit it before sunrise. The curtain at the little window was drawn back. Light fell in a soft gold line across the carved table. Everett stood by the stove. Adeline sat down at the table. Preston stood across from her, his lawyer at his right shoulder, the deputy sheriff in the doorway. The three siblings pressed against the curve of the inner wall. Adeline reached for the tin box. She opened it. She took out the deed. She laid it on the table. She took out the handwritten will dated 1897. She laid that on the table. She took out the heavy cream-colored document with the cracked leather binding and the brass clasp and the ribbon. She laid it on the table. She turned it so the lawyer could read the first page. She said, "This is the Whitaker Family Trust, established in March of 1897 by Eliza Whitaker, the original document. I believe you will want to read pages 12 through 14. The lawyer did not move. "Sir," Adeline said not unkindly, "please read." He read. His face, which had been professionally neutral, did something slow and ugly. The neutrality did not so much drop away as bleed out of him. He read page 12. He read page 13. He read page 14. He reached page 15 where the family seal had been pressed into red wax 129 years ago by the hand of a woman who had died a widow in a farmhouse 2 ridges east of here. He touched the seal with one finger very gently as if afraid he might break it. He looked at Preston. "Mr. Whitaker," the lawyer said. "A word." Preston did not move. "A word, Mr. Whitaker. Outside. Now, please." "What is it?" "Sir, please." Preston looked at his mother. He looked at the document on the table. He looked back at his lawyer. "Just tell me." The lawyer took a breath. He seemed for a man in his profession to be measuring each word very carefully. Sir, the 200 acres surrounding this tree are held in perpetual trust. Since 1897, the timber cannot be cut, the land cannot be sold. Any transfer of any portion of this land requires the signed and notarized consent of every living lineal descendant of Eliza Whitaker. The sale you closed with Hartwell Development 6 weeks ago is not voidable. It is void, ab initio, from the moment of signing. It has been void for 6 weeks. It was never a sale. You have not had the legal right to transfer that timber. Preston's face did not change, but his hands, which had been in the pockets of his coat, came out. There's a further matter, Mr. Whitaker. Page 14, paragraph 3. Any descendant who knowingly attempts to convey, encumber, or destroy the protected land in violation of the trust is by the terms of the instrument permanently disinherited. All future and contingent interest forfeit. The lawyer closed the document. He stepped back from the table. He would not look at Preston anymore. The hollow was very quiet. Meredith whispered, "Preston." He did not answer her. He was looking at his mother. Adeline Whitaker looked back at him. She did not speak. She did not need to. This was the moment. Preston, who had always been the quickest of the four at arithmetic, did his arithmetic one last time. He saw very clearly what would happen if this story stopped here. A voided sale was a bad outcome. A personal lawsuit from Hartwell for the commission he had already been paid would be worse. But neither was catastrophic. He was a banker. He had bounced back from worse. The catastrophe was his mother. His mother had known. His mother had been waiting. His mother, a 68-year-old woman who had spent 46 years in a farmhouse kitchen, and who he had privately, for most of his adult life, considered to be not especially bright, had sat down at this table with 3 documents in front of her, and had allowed him to petition the court to declare her incompetent before she had produced them, which meant his mother had wanted the petition to be filed, which meant his mother had wanted him to make the largest mistake of his professional life in front of a deputy sheriff, which meant his mother knew something else. He opened his mouth to speak. He was too late. Sloane Whitaker stepped forward from the curve of the inner wall. She had been very quiet until that moment. Her dark hair was still tied back under her wool cap. Her hands were steady. The folder she took out of the inside pocket of her parka was a slim, black plastic folder of the kind you buy at an office supply store for $4. It did not look impressive. It did not need to. She laid it on the table in front of her mother. "Mama." "Sloane, I've known for 6 months." Adeline looked at her youngest daughter. For the first time that morning, her face changed. Her eyes filled. She did not cry, but her eyes filled. Sloane kept her voice level. "I didn't stop calling because I stopped loving you. I stopped calling because I couldn't tell you what I was doing, and I couldn't lie to you on the phone. And if I'd stayed in touch the way I'd been, he would have figured it out before I had enough." She turned to face her oldest brother. "Preston, I've been going through your email for 6 months. I've been going through your corporate drive. I've been going through Hartwell Development's correspondence with you back to the first outreach in May of 2023. I know about the commission. I know the exact number. I know who wired it and through what account. I know about the addendum you signed last month to authorize the survey team to enter the North Ridge on the 3rd Monday of next month. That is, I'm not finished." Preston closed his mouth. Sloane opened the folder. "I know about a meeting between you and a man named Avery Hartwell in the spring of 2023. I have the expense report. I have the restaurant. I have a photograph from the restaurant security system. Avery Hartwell is the grandson of Clifton Hartwell, who founded Hartwell Development in 1982. Clifton Hartwell died in 2017. Before he died, he was the 3rd man." Preston went still. Sloane did not look at her mother. She did not look at Everett. She kept her eyes on Preston. I know about Grandpa Silas Preston. I know about the pressure campaign Hartwell ran on him for 2 years. I know about the refusals he put in writing. I know about the logging permit Lowell Deacon signed 2 days before Grandpa died. I have the permit. I have Lowell's signature. I have a copy of the accident report that says no witnesses. I have 3 interviews with men who were on that crew in 1995, 2 of whom are still alive, both of whom I found, one of whom was willing to sign an affidavit last month. And I have a photograph, 1995, Grandpa Silas Lowell Deacon, young man in a suit. She did not have to say who. Preston's face had gone the color of paper. Sloane kept going. Her voice did not rise. Her voice did not shake. The voice that came out of her was the voice of a woman who had carried this for a long time, and who had measured every syllable of this speech 100 times in the dark. When you started talking to Hartwell last spring, I didn't understand it at first. You didn't need the money. You had plenty. I thought maybe you'd made a mistake. I started looking. What I found wasn't a mistake. What I found was a plan. You were going to get Dad to sign something that looked routine. You were going to hold it until you could use the power of attorney. You were going to sell the land to a company that had already tried a generation ago to take it from Grandpa. And when Grandpa had said no, that company had put him under a falling limb in the spring of 1995. You can't. Preston. I have the bank records. I have the emails. I have the affidavit. I have the corroborating timeline from 1995. I have an attorney in Raleigh who has been retained for 4 months and who has, as of yesterday afternoon, filed a sealed federal complaint with the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of North Carolina. She's a good lawyer. Her name is Inez Delacroix. You'll meet her next week. She closed the folder. She slid it across the table, not to her mother, but to Adeline's side of the table, into Adeline's hands. It's yours, Mama. Whatever you want to do with it, it's yours. Adeline Whitaker took the folder. Her hand for the first time that morning was not steady. The hollow was so quiet you could hear the candle on the shelf burning. Preston stood on the other side of the table. His face had not broken. He was not a man whose face broke in public. He had spent 25 years training it not to. But his shoulders had come down. His hands hung at his sides. He looked for the first time since he was 8 years old like a boy. The deputy sheriff in the doorway cleared his throat. Mr. Whitaker. Preston did not answer him. Mr. Whitaker, sir, I'm going to ask you to step outside with me, please. Preston looked at Adeline. Adeline did not meet his eyes. She was looking down at the folder in her hands. He walked out. The lawyer followed. The deputy followed. The door of the grandfather oak swung slowly shut behind them on its wooden hinges. Inside the hollow, it was just the family now. Meredith slid down the inner wall and sat on the floor with her knees drawn up, crying into her sleeve. Garrett crossed to his mother. He knelt beside her chair. He put his forehead against her shoulder and he did not speak. And Adeline, who had not held her 3rd child in 4 years, put one thin hand on the back of his gray-streaked hair. Sloane stood where she was. She was shaking now. Whatever she had been holding in to get through the speech had begun to let go in small tremors along her jaw and her shoulders. Everett walked across the hollow. He was the one who crossed to Sloane. He did not speak. He simply took his youngest child in his arms the way he had taken her in his arms when she was 4 years old and had fallen off a fence, and he held her there, and after a moment, Sloane Whitaker, who had not cried in front of anyone in over a decade, cried into her father's flannel shirt. Adeline watched them. She did not cry. Her eyes were dry, but her hand on the back of her son Garrett's head was gentle. The hearing next month never happened because the hearing next month was not necessary. The federal complaint Sloane's lawyer Inez Delacroix had filed in sealed form was unsealed in the first week of January. The United States Attorney for the Western District of North Carolina held a press conference on a Thursday morning in which the words wire fraud and conspiracy and elder financial abuse were used in sequence about a senior executive at a certain Charlotte bank and about the principal officers of Hartwell Development, LLC. The announcement was covered by every major outlet in the state and by 3 in the nation. The state of North Carolina, in a separate action, reopened the case of one Silas Whitaker, deceased in April of 1995, formerly of Briar Hollow, County of Avery. The investigation is ongoing. What happens to the surviving principals at Hartwell and to a certain senior banker on Tryon Street is a matter for a slow process of courts and juries that is still unfinished. Preston Whitaker resigned from his position at the bank on the Friday of that week. He was placed on administrative leave before he could resign. But he resigned anyway, because even in disgrace, a man likes the illusion of having chosen. His wife filed for divorce on the following Monday. His children, who were teenagers, did not speak to him for a long time. None of that would have saved the land by itself. The land had been saved already by Eliza Whitaker in March of 1897 with a fountain pen and a notary's seal, and the foresight of a woman who had buried a husband young and had no intention of letting any man ever again tell her daughters what to do with the forest. But the rest of it, the reckoning, the 30-year-old accident report, reopened the public shaming of a company that had killed a man in a Blue Ridge spring that was Sloan. And the forgiveness, or the version of it that came next, was Adeline. Adeline did not press charges against Preston personally for the attempted guardianship petition. She did not have to. The federal case ate him. There was nothing left for a personal suit to take. But she was asked by Inez Delacroix whether she wished to submit a victim statement for the sentencing phase if it ever came to that. She said she did. She wrote the statement herself in the hollow of the grandfather oak by the light of a beeswax candle in pencil on a tablet of lined paper Mabel had given her. She wrote in part the following: "My son did a terrible thing. He did it to me and to his father. Before he did it to us, his company did it to my husband's father 30 years ago, and took from us a good and quiet man who deserved better than a falling limb on a Tuesday afternoon. I will not ask this court to spare my son any of what the law requires. That is not my place. I will only say this. My son was not born a thief. Somewhere in the years when he was learning how to be a man, he decided that what a thing cost on a spreadsheet was more important than what it cost a family. I do not know when he decided this. I do not know that I could have stopped him from deciding it. I only know that I would like him, when the law is done with him, to have the chance to come home and learn that he decided wrong. Whether he takes that chance is his to decide. I have in this matter, as in all others, done what I can." She signed it. She gave it to Sloan, who gave it to the lawyer who filed it in due course. When the story of what had happened in Briar Hollow reached the papers, it was no longer the story Jasper Holt had photographed. It had become a larger story. It became for a few weeks that winter a national story. Letters came. They came to the Briar Hollow post office, which did not know what to do with them because they were addressed to the old couple in the tree, Briar Hollow, North Carolina. The postmaster, a soft-spoken woman named Hazel Rourke who had known Adeline for 30 years, put them all in a canvas mail sack and drove them to Mabel Ashford's farmhouse in her own truck, and Mabel carried them one sackful at a time up the ridge. Some of the letters were from strangers. Some were from other old couples. Some were from sons and daughters who had not spoken to their parents in years, writing to say that they had picked up the phone that week for the first time. There was a letter from a bank executive in Atlanta, 5 paragraphs long, which Adeline read twice and then folded and placed in her apron pocket, and about which she said nothing to anyone. There was a letter from a high school teacher in a small town in Iowa. The teacher had used Jasper Holt's photographs with her American literature class. The class had written an essay collection about home. The essays were enclosed. Adeline read every one of them by candlelight over the course of 3 evenings. There was a cashier's check for $94,000. It was anonymous. The memo line said, "For Mrs. Whitaker," from someone who never called her mother back. Adeline gave the check to Sloane. She said, "Put this toward the foundation." That was the first time she had said the word. The Whitaker Legacy Foundation was formally established in the spring. It took the 200 acres of protected forest around the grandfather oak out of the private hands of a single family and placed it in permanent conservation under a new charter drafted by Inez Delacroix and a team of non-profit attorneys working at Delacroix's request at reduced rates. The charter was careful. The land could not be sold. The trees could not be cut. The grandfather oak specifically was given its own protected status, a designation usually reserved for state landmarks for which the foundation had paid a small administrative fee. The second purpose of the foundation took longer. On the site of the old Whitaker farmhouse, which the Hartwell development parcel reverted to after the voided sale was formally unwound, Adeline and Everett, with the help of Garrett, who was a decent carpenter when he wanted to be, and with the help of Sloane, who knew how to write a grant proposal, broke ground on what would become the Silas Whitaker home for the quietly forgotten. It was a small residence, 12 rooms, a shared kitchen, a garden in the back where Adeline herself, now 71, taught the residents how to grow tomatoes and pole beans and 3 kinds of squash, the way her grandmother had first shown her in 1962. It was a place for old men and old women whose children did not come to see them anymore. There was no charge. There was a long list. There were volunteers. There was for every resident a cast iron pot on the stove that came from no particular family, but from which somehow every meal tasted a little like a meal from your own mother's kitchen, if your mother had been a good cook and had loved you. Adeline did not live in the home. She lived in the tree. She went down the ridge every morning. She walked back up every evening. Everett went with her. Sometimes on the hardest days when her back hurt too much for the climb, Garrett drove her up a fire road he had cleared himself in a used pickup he had bought for the purpose, and he did not complain about the hour it took him. She lived in the tree because she had promised it. She had promised it the first night she slept inside it. She had promised it when she found the tin box beneath the root. She had promised it the morning she opened Mabel Ashford's diary and understood what her family had already paid for this place. The tree had waited for her for 129 years. She was not going to leave it because her knees hurt. Mabel Ashford lived 3 more years. She came up the ridge once a week for tea. She sat in one of the carved chairs. She drank out of the wooden cup Everett had made for Jasper Holt, which had over time become Mabel's cup. She and Adeline did not talk much about what had passed. They talked about the weather, about the new preacher, about Mabel's grandson's new baby, about a recipe Mabel had remembered for a cornbread Adeline's own mother had used to make. When Mabel died in her sleep in her own farmhouse bed, Adeline was with her. Mabel's last word was not a word at all, only a small, quiet sound that Adeline took to mean yes. The Whitaker Legacy Foundation received a bequest in Mabel's will of $31,000. The note accompanying the bequest in Mabel's small, careful handwriting read, "For the garden." Sloane moved back to Briar Hollow in the 2nd year. She did not marry. She did not have children. She took a small cottage on the county road about a mile from Mabel's, and she ran the foundation out of a converted barn. She came up the ridge most Sundays to have supper with her parents in the hollow of the grandfather oak. She brought her father a new chisel one spring that she had ordered from a toolmaker in Maine. Everett used it for the rest of his life. Meredith came up less often. She was still in Atlanta. Her marriage had not survived the trial. Her boys, by the time they were teenagers, had been coming up to visit their grandparents on school breaks for years. Garrett settled in a farmhouse 2 miles from his parents. He did the maintenance on the residence. He built benches for the garden. He drove his mother up the fire road on days when the weather was bad. Preston served his sentence. When it was done, he came home. He came home because his mother had said in her statement to the court that she would like him to have the chance. He came home because he had no other home. He came home because he was 51 years old and he had lost everything a man can lose that is not himself. And what was left of himself was not much, but was perhaps still savable. Adeline did not meet him at the bus station. Garrett did. Adeline met him at the door of the grandfather oak. She did not say anything. She held the door open. He walked in. There was a plate of food on the table. Stew, potatoes, a crust of bread from the oven at the residence. Preston sat down. He ate. His mother sat across from him. She did not watch him. She was darning a sock. The candle on the shelf burned low. The stove was warm. After a long time, Preston said, "Mom." "Yes, Preston. I'm sorry." Adeline put down the sock. She looked at her oldest son. He was no longer the man in the charcoal suit. His hair had gone mostly gray. He had lost weight. His hands, which had been soft, were not soft anymore. He had been working in a prison carpentry program for 3 years under an old foreman who had taught him what to do with a chisel. And his hands had calluses now, and he did not quite know what to do with them. Adeline Whitaker looked at her oldest son for a long moment. She said, "I know." That was all she said. It was enough. He worked with his father every weekend for the rest of his father's life. They didn't talk much. Everett had never been a man who talked much. Preston learned in those weekends that a father does not need to say a thing out loud for a son to understand it. When Everett wanted Preston to pick up a board, Everett nodded at the board. When Everett wanted Preston to hand him the brace and bit, Everett held out his hand. They built a chicken coop together for the residents. They built benches for the garden. They rebuilt the porch of the old farmhouse that had become the Silas Whitaker home. One Saturday in April, they built a small carved door. It was made of white oak. It was hung on wooden hinges. It was fitted by the end of that day into a small hollow that Everett had, without telling anyone, been quietly preparing in the base of a young oak about 50 yards east of the grandfather, which would in another 150 years be a tree itself, a sapling grandchild of the old one. Everett sat down on a log after they hung that door. His knees were bad. He was 80 by then. He looked up at Preston, who was standing with his hands on his hips, looking at the door the two of them had just hung. Everett said, "Son." "Yeah, Dad." "That's a good door." Preston looked away for a long moment. Everett Whitaker died that winter in his sleep in the hollow of the grandfather oak, with his wife's hand in his and the stove warm and the candle on the shelf burning low. Adeline lived 6 more years. She lived them in the tree and in the residence and in the garden and in the company of her 3 surviving children and of her grandchildren and of a slow, steady stream of old men and old women who came to live at the Silas Whitaker home. Some of them for a few months before they died. Some of them for years. All of them for the last chapter of a life that had seemed before they arrived to have ended without one. She didn't cry very often in those years, but sometimes late at night, alone in the hollow of the tree with the wind outside and the stove warm, and the photograph of 4 small faces still hanging low on the inner wall. She would put one hand flat against the living wood of the inside of the tree. She would feel the wood, solid, warm, older than anything she had ever touched or would ever touch again. She would think about a door that had slammed shut on a gravel drive 40 years ago, and she would think that was not the end. The door she and her husband had built with his chisels and her curtain and her hand over his on the first cold night. when neither of them knew how the story would turn out, was the door that mattered, because that was the door they chose to open.